There was a question I was talking with Coyote, a guy that's here. He's working on a place called Africa House.
Right.
And I was saying, like, here the kente cloth is very prevalent. Is the kente cloth just one of a universal nature, or is your studies have made you feel closer to the kente Ansante group?
Well, no. I think that there is a general identification with continental things.
Okay.
In other words, I think that that the African American population is truly an African population, as opposed to a Yoruba population, an Asante population, or Nuba population, or in other words, that we have merged as Africans in America. You know, and so I think it's quite natural that much of the general culture of Africa will be appealing to us. Right now, kente happens to be popular. The Asante stools happen to be popular. However, it is also the case that if you remember the 50s, the Yoruba materials were popular, and the Igbo materials were popular. When we wore the dashikis and the agbabas and the clothing, more of the clothing of the Nigerians is worn than the clothing of the Ghanaians, you know. And now you find, in addition to that, go all the way to the east of Africa, and you'll find that many people are picking up some of the symbols of Kemet. You know, for example, you know, I have one here, the Ankh, also a cartouche, or Shin as it should be called, with the principles, the divine principles of wisdom and the divine principles of truth. And so we look at that, but I don't think it's a doctrinaire kind of identification. It's that as you sample the culture of the entire continent, there are symbols, there are functional things that are part of the vast cultural wealth of the continent, and that the happy thing about being here is that we can use any of that we want to.
One other question, Liberia, and its relationship with was Liberia the continent, not the continent, but the country that was built as a result of Americans leaving? Was that part of the Garvey movement there? And what do you feel about what's going on now?
Well, of course, I'm very much distressed and pained about what's going on now, but it's a very complex story. You know, Liberia is the place where the American Colonization Society helped relocate many people. They tell me some of these people were their children. You know, some of the whites had children and they didn't want to deal with their children, so they made it possible for them to have another place where they could be. So there was some of that, and then there was also people that they had enslaved that could get free and they could go back. So, but it was not just from the United States. It was also from what we call the West Indies, and probably a larger number of ex-slaves from the West Indies were taken to Liberia. And also there was the British did the same thing in Sierra Leone, which is right next door to Liberia. So this was a resettlement of Africans from the continent. And then later in the 20s, you know, the Garvey movement had some people, some numbers of the Garvey movement from the United States went back to Liberia and joined this previous settlement. So, and then they had their own problems because there were the people from the outside and the people from the groups that were on the inside who'd always been there, and they had to work out their difficulties in the context of foreign powers trying to manipulate problems between people. So a large part of what you're seeing right now in Liberia is the outcome of foreign domination, and in the case of Liberia, it's United States domination, because that's the only thing, only place on the continent where the United States really had overt toehold. You know, almost all the other countries are identified with England, France, Portugal, or something like that. But the United States had a pseudo relationship. It wasn't really a colonial relationship, but Liberia really wasn't out from under the thumb of the United States in terms of its banking, its currency, in terms of the ownership of the major resources there, like rubber, iron ore, and so forth. And so and the United States has an interest in terms of its transmitter and the Voice of America, Roberts Field International Airport, as far as the strategic play. So they have an interest, and they also have an influence that gets into local politics, which means that it's hard for Africans to solve their own problems. And so there's stuff inside and there's stuff outside that make that a very complex, and at this point, an extremely painful and disappointing thing, because the Liberia I knew, it's hard for me to think of the numbers of people who died, the destruction, the people, as I understand it right now, are literally in famine, and I saw one report in the paper that people actually eating dogs, the dogs eating the bodies of people eating the dogs. I mean, because it's so much destruction has been wrought, and there's almost no international outcry on that. Is that
seemingly a problem now with the whole continent of Africa?
Yes.
That it has so much outside influence? Because when we were there, the devastation from the north and south of how Dr. Ben does his tour, I was just like, I was in such a state of shock, to see just so much. They said, well, it was poverty from my perspective, but I said people were still not living, even within, the context of their living, there seemed to be a great despair there.
Yeah, well, Africa as a continent was very wealthy at the point of the slave trade. And it would be hard for us to see because all of it wasn't in the money economy.
Right.
But it's almost impossible to function in 1990 out of the money economy. So what you see is poverty on the African continent. And much of that is because the former colonial powers have never left. They're still there, even with independent countries. You go to Nigeria, you got an independent country, but who runs the banking system? What about the relationship to the World Bank and loans? There are too many people off the continent. If you look in Southern Africa, look at Angola, and look at the war that's still being financed by the United States government and also by the South African government collaborating. They're funding Joseph Savimbi to try to destabilize a government. These are not Africans solving their own problems. These are people who see a strategic interest in Africa, trying to keep the fan the fire. And so, it's a pattern that you saw in South America, and it's still present on the continent of Africa. There's very little of what you call true self-determination, in spite of the fact that you have the visible. Many people they've got their parliaments and their president and so forth, but if you don't control your money, if you don't control your banks, and if you don't control the rest of the economy by extension, if you can't defend yourself, militarily, then you're only partially free.
One question I had here was, as far as maybe beginning to get the influence in the classroom, and some suggestions that people in America that are trying to work back and forth, is it better to just try to work from this end, or go over there and work from that end, or are there maybe some synced ways to bridge the gap to work back and forth to help build on both sides of the water?
Well, I think it's like the boat sinking, and what do? Bail, water, or paddle? Well, the answer is that you have to bail, water, and paddle at the same time. And so we don't have the luxury, and so that means that those who can do something on the continent have to do it. But it also means that we have to take another perspective, which is that everybody doesn't have to go to the continent to do something. That one of the major services that we could provide to the African continent is to become wealthy and powerful right here. Because then we would become influential in terms of what public policy is, in terms of our ability to provide financial support to the continent, to later provide whatever kind of technical contribution and help, educational help, and so forth.
So you feel that would be welcome? Because they were always given this thing that, and there's probably was a myth perpetuated that, Africans don't want you over there either. And I heard this growing up all my life, that, why go to Africa? They don't want you. Y'all.
Yeah, well, of course, I lived there 6 years, and I know lots of people who've lived in Africa, and that is the biggest lie that's ever been told.
Good. Yes.
African people were incredibly hospitable to us, and we saw many people, that if we had wanted to stay, the doors were open, and many of our closest friends are from the continent today. Friendships that we made there have lasted over, I left the African continent last as a resident 1970. I've been back many times since then. But what happened was that many European Americans told Africans that African Americans didn't like them. Then they came here and told us that went to Africa. Yeah, they told Africans that we didn't like them. Then they came here and told us they didn't like us.
Okay.
In fact, when I went to Africa in 1963, part of my orientation for Peace Corps was that don't go over there feeling that you're going to have any special relationship with African people. I was told that by officials of the Peace Corps, and also later by officials of the Agency for International Development. And that was part of their orientation for people going overseas. Nothing could have been further from the truth.
Okay.
We did indeed, not only were we welcome, but there was a special bond that existed between Africans in America and Africa. And that's the problem, is that many people fear that bond. They don't want us to have that kind of identification. The same kind of identification that Europeans have with Europe is feared if Africans have that identification with their own people.
With their own people.
And so there is African people, not only would they welcome it, they've invited us. Mugabe came here and spoke at Morehouse, and at that point invited people to come with their talents to help and assist Zimbabwe to get on its feet. And so as long as we have some skills to offer, things like that, I don't think anybody wants somebody to come over there and be a drain, to be lazy, to have nothing to offer, because they got enough problems as it is. But I think that's something that really needs to be reviewed, because that was totally in opposition to the experience that I had.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Good.